Hi, I'm Atiya. I work at Aangan. Aangan is a child protection organization, and we are concerned with strengthening child protection systems. We're concerned with strengthening formal as well as informal child protection systems because we think that all children everywhere have the right to be safe. And when we talk about safety, we really mean that they have the right to be in school, they have the right to have support of community and family, and that above all else, they should be safe from harms like child trafficking, child labor, child marriage, and exploitation. I think to understand that question, really, we need to just remember how closely linked children's safety and protection is with the general well-being and safety and protection of their families and also their communities. I think we all understand that vulnerable children come from vulnerable families who come from vulnerable communities. So, like, child harm doesn't happen in a vacuum. So when we're thinking about the pandemic, and we're thinking about what's happening to families, then obviously the same thing is what's happening with families. There is first and foremost, of course, the dread of the illness itself and all of what that is causing to communities. We also understand that the COVID is raging right now, but it's been a long, hard year. It's been a long, hard year of like joblessness, of hunger. So there are obviously those things as well that children, just like their families, are also facing. And as family vulnerability keeps increasing, over month on month, children's vulnerability increases. And what does that mean? It means that families are sometimes forced to make decisions, what we call adaptive practices, and they're adaptive practices to the changing circumstances, to the changing economic hardships that they're facing, oftentimes have a very difficult and bad reaction, impact on their children. Specifically, we look at issues of child labor. We all understand schools are closed. Schools have been closed for, a year now. All these kids that we've all spent so many years trying to get back into school now had nowhere to go. And so a lot of those children are now have entered the labor force. I saw a study by an organization called CACL, and they just looked at Tamilnadu, for instance, and they found that there was an increase in child labor by 280% just during this last year. So then you can imagine what that impact is for children everywhere. We look at issues of child marriage. Just Aangan alone in the last year been able to stop and negotiate through, the women volunteers that we work with, more than 400 marriages. Why did the need for marriages spike at this time? Well, there were a variety of reasons. One, economic hardship and sort of lessening the burden on the family by marrying girls off. But also it had, the pandemic had strange reactions, like the cost of marriages went down because you didn't have to invite as many people. Dowries went down. So this all made child marriages spike. We look at issues of family violence. I know that that's something that you guys have also been very concerned with, and you know how that has spiked everywhere. When we talk about family violence, children not only witness violence within the household, but they also experience violence. So these are the very, and then there's child trafficking, which is a very sort of much more hidden, but as children, went into lockdown, we have to always understand that whenever there's a disaster, and I think there's a lot written in the global literature, when there's disaster, when there's difficulty, predatory sort of forces like traffickers are able to prey that much easier because families are much more vulnerable to falling sort of into the trap of sending their children off after some lucrative job offer or some seemingly happy sounding marriage, which is actually really just an invitation to trafficking. So these are all of the things that we're very concerned with. These are the very obvious things, of child harm that we look at. But we also have to be able to, with children, look at and understand what the social isolation and the loneliness and the disconnection has done to children. This has been an inordinately hard year for kids. who've been cut off from absolutely everything. And it's not something we should take lightly, It's not something that we should just say, oh, it's a mental health thing and, great, someday we'll be able to look at that. Because in our experience of working in shelter and rescue homes, where children are taken once they've been rescued from a situation of harm, we know the countless number of children who tell stories about how they were lonely, they were sad, they were isolated, there was no one to talk to. That forced them to maybe run away. That forced them to become more vulnerable to, any offer made by some random man or some random trafficker saying, "Aa jao mere saath shehar mein, main dikha dunga, bahut acha, dusra zindagi dikha dunga." And that child who's isolated and living in some remote place and hasn't spoken to anybody in a year, that child is very susceptible to something like that. So, we have to look at this whole thing quite holistically, because at every level, from hunger and survival to just, desperate loneliness, it has been a very, very brutal year for children and their families.